Friends, welcome to another Before You Read lecture. This is the Before You Read lecture for the first 7 chapters of the Gospel of Matthew. So Matthew's chapter 1 through 7. This section of Matthew's Gospel will take us from the very beginnings of Jesus' life, his genealogy, in fact, his predecessors, his connection to some of the great figures in the history of Israel, through the end of his first extended discourse, known as the Sermon on the Mount in chapters 5 through 7. So it really is setting the stage, if you will, for the Gospel of Matthew and how it tells the story of Jesus' life. I've already mentioned the genealogy, which is the first 17 verses of chapter 1. While it might be easy to just skip over this because it's a bunch of names, some of which are not familiar to you, I'd invite you to read it carefully and keep track of the way that Matthew represents or locates Jesus in the history of Israel. You might be interested as well to note the women who are named in the genealogy. And if you can recall their background, they're not always the most predictable women to be included in this sort of genealogy, or a genealogy of this sort of person. From 1:18 through 2:23, there is a rather extended narrative about the birth of Jesus and the following years. Remember, the Gospel of Mark does not mention the birth of Jesus. Jesus shows up on the scene as an adult. The Gospel of Matthew gives us some details about the birth of Jesus. We get this very important name for Jesus in 1:23, Emmanuel, which means God with us. A quotation from the book of Isaiah. There's some dispute in terms of the differences in meaning between a Hebrew word, which can mean young lady, Alma, and the Greek word parthenos, which means virgin. And we'll talk about that. We can explore that further. But this idea that a virgin would give birth and that the son of that virgin would be called Emmanuel most likely meant one thing in its original context in Isaiah, and it's been repurposed in the story of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew. And as we'll see as we journey through the Gospel of Matthew together, Jesus does present God with us. He becomes the manifestation of God's presence and God's power in the earth in important ways. So even from the beginning of his birth, this is something we're told to be on the lookout for. Jesus and his family must flee from the murderous plans of Herod, the ruler of the Judean region, who fears a rival king will become a competitor for the throne. And while there is a debate and there's some questions about the historical veracity of this flight to Egypt, it plays a very significant role in Matthew's portrait of Jesus, because you will remember that another group, another son or sons of Israel, son of God rather, made a trip from Egypt. And so here in this reference to Jesus going to Egypt and then eventually returning from Egypt, we begin to see some of the ways in which Matthew portrays Jesus as the obedient Son of God, in contrast to the wilderness generation who were a disobedient family or sons of God. Chapter 3 is almost entirely about John the Baptist. Again, a little bit of an expansion from what we've seen in the Gospel of Mark. And one of the important things to note is the way that Jesus and John speak with one another, and in particular, the way in which John is presented as being quite deferential to Jesus. He is happy to, he's reluctant rather, to baptize Jesus because he immediately recognizes Jesus as someone greater. And it's possible that here we have a glimpse into some of the controversies in the early church about the authority of Jesus versus the authority of John the Baptist. In chapter 4, this is really the beginnings of Jesus' earthly ministry. Just as we saw in the Gospel of Mark, before Jesus gets on the scene, he must experience and come out successful in the temptation narrative in the wilderness. The Gospel of Mark was very, very short. Matthew expands it and gives us a sense of what Jesus endured and how he endured it. And then in chapter 5, verses 1 through chapter 7, 28, this is one of the distinctive teaching moments in the Gospel of Matthew. It's known as the Sermon on the Mount. There's material in it that resembles material in the Gospel of Luke, but it is fairly unique in many ways. And there are different ways of thinking about its parts, some consistency, some things that are harder to connect. But in general, this is a teaching about what it means to be a distinctive follower of Jesus. And how does that align with the practices and the requirements of the Jewish law, of Jewish religious ritual and religious life, and of ways of relating to others and other sorts of things. So it's a lesson on ethics and identity. It opens with the Beatitudes in 5, 1 through 12. It does this extended narrative, an important narrative about Jesus' relationship to the law, to Torah, in 5, 17 through 48. And then it covers a variety of topics that are religious and social in nature, all, I think, with the goal of highlighting the distinctiveness of those who follow in the way of Jesus. How the teaching of Jesus, the authoritative teaching of Jesus that is said to fulfill the Torah, makes the followers of Jesus into a distinctive group of people. So, as you read this material, I invite you to keep just a couple of things in mind. The first is the degree to which Jesus is presented and how he relates to the other institutions of Judaism in his day. One of the things that scholars, specialists in the Gospel of Matthew notice is that Jewishness, the Jewishness of Jesus and Jesus' relationship with Judaism is a significant theme, and that this may reflect the experience of a community that associated themselves with Jesus and with Matthew's gospel, and were trying to sort out their experience of alienation and exclusion. The second thing to figure or to read and to pay attention to, I think, is the Sermon on the Mount. Interpreters have regarded this in a variety of ways. Martin Luther says it is sort of an impossible ethic, or that its simple point is to make us realize that we can't be perfect, and therefore it meant to lead us to repentance. Others, like Martin Luther King Jr., have taken this as an image of the beloved community that can be realized, that should be realized in Christian community. And so as you read it, think about what about the Sermon on the Mount seems feasible, what seems infeasible, what would be practical, what would be helpful in your context, and what might not be so relevant or helpful. Jesus is presented in new ways and in old ways in the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew both builds on what he found in the Gospel of Mark and tells his own story of Jesus. And I can't wait to discuss these beginning chapters of Matthew with you all. Happy reading.